Cursed Cassettes presents.
I'd been meaning to sell my old bike for a while. It had been sitting in my garage collecting dust, and I figured Facebook Marketplace was the easiest way to get rid of it. Within a few hours of posting the ad, I got a message from a guy named Steve. He seemed normal enough, said he was looking for a bike to get back into riding, and asked a few questions about the condition. His profile looked legit too. I saw pictures of him with his dog, a couple of vacation photos, nothing out of the ordinary. We exchanged a few messages, and he offered to come pick it up that evening. I was home, so I thought, why not? I gave him my address, and he said he'd be there in an hour. When Steve arrived, everything seemed fine. He pulled up in a beat-up old truck, and I met him out front with the bike. He was a little older than I expected, probably in his mid-40s, but he was friendly enough. We talked for a bit about the bike. He paid in cash, and that was it. The whole exchange took less than 10 minutes. I remember feeling pretty good about how smoothly it went. No hassle, no back and forth, just a quick sale. The next day, I got a message from him. It was just a short, "Thanks again for the bike." I thought it was a little weird to follow up, but maybe he was just being polite. I responded with a simple, "No problem, enjoy," and didn't think much of it. That's when things started getting strange. A couple of days later, I got another message from him. This time, it wasn't about the bike. He said something like, "I drove by your street today and noticed you weren't home. Where were you?" That threw me off. I didn't remember telling him where I worked or what my schedule was. So how would he know I wasn't home? I didn't respond right away. I just sat there staring at the message, feeling this growing sense of unease. But eventually, I brushed it off, as maybe just a weird comment. Maybe he was trying to make conversation, and I was overthinking it. A couple of days later, I got another message from him. "I saw your car was parked out front last night, but your lights were off. You home?" At that point, alarm bells were going off in my head. He was clearly keeping an eye on my house. How else would he know when I was home or not? I responded with something short, like, "Hey man, that's kinda creepy. Please stop messaging me." I blocked him after that, thinking that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. The next day, I saw his truck parked at the end of my street. It was just sitting there, engine off, like he was watching my house. I tried to stay calm and told myself he could have just been passing by or had some other reason to be there. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. That night, I heard a car idling outside my window. I peeked through the blinds, and sure enough, it was Steve's truck again. This time, he was just sitting in the driver's seat, staring straight at my house. My heart was racing, and I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the police, but what could I tell them? That some guy who bought my bike was sitting outside my house? It wasn't illegal, but it was terrifying. For the next few days, I kept seeing him around. Sometimes it was his truck parked a few streets over. Other times I'd catch a glimpse of him walking past my house, like he was casually in the neighborhood. He never approached me directly, but he made sure I knew he was there. The final straw came about a week later. I woke up to find a note stuck to my front door. There was no envelope, just a plain piece of paper with handwriting on it. It said, "I know you're home alone. Why don't you come outside and talk?" I was done playing nice. I called the police and explained the situation, but they said there wasn't much they could do. Steve hadn't technically broken any laws. He hadn't threatened me directly or tried to enter my house. They advised me to document everything and to call them if he made any more direct contact. That wasn't exactly comforting. Knowing he was still out there, watching me, just waiting for his next move, made me feel trapped in my own home. I took a few days off work and stayed with a friend for a while, just to clear my head. When I came back, I didn't see his truck anymore. The messages stopped. For a while, I thought maybe he'd moved on, lost interest, or found a new target. But even now, months later, I'm still paranoid. Every time I hear a car slow down outside, I feel that same sickening dread, wondering if it's Steve, back to pick up where he left off. I haven't sold anything on Facebook Marketplace since. I had this old couch sitting in my living room that I needed to get rid of before moving to my new place. It wasn't in bad condition, just a little worn from a few years of use, so I figured I could sell it cheap on Facebook Marketplace and be done with it. Within an hour of posting the listing, I got a message from a guy who seemed interested. His name was Eric, and he asked a few standard questions: what condition the couch was in, how old it was, whether it had any stains, stuff like that. He seemed friendly enough. We went back and forth a bit, and then he offered to come by that evening to pick it up. I was home, and I wanted the couch gone, so I agreed. He said he'd be bringing a friend to help him load it into his truck, which made sense to me because the couch was pretty heavy. When the time came, Eric messaged me to say they were about 10 minutes away. As I waited for them to arrive, something started to feel off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Maybe it was the fact that they wanted to come so late. It was getting dark, and I don't usually like dealing with strangers after dark, but I figured I was just being paranoid. After all, it was just a simple sale. When they finally showed up, the uneasiness I'd been feeling turned into something more like dread. Eric and his friend pulled up in an old, beat-up truck, and as soon as I saw them get out, I knew something wasn't right. They were both bigger than I had imagined from our conversation, taller and more muscular. Eric had a shaved head and tattoos running down his arms, while the other guy, who never introduced himself, just stood there with this cold, blank expression on his face. No small talk, no greeting, just staring. Eric was the only one who spoke, and even then, he didn't say much. He asked where the couch was, and I led them inside, trying to keep the conversation casual to ease my nerves. But as soon as they stepped into my house, I could feel the tension. Eric glanced around the room, like he was sizing the place up, while his friend stood by the door, barely moving, barely blinking. I suddenly regretted letting them inside at all. I pointed to the couch, hoping they'd just grab it and go, but instead, Eric started asking weird questions. He wanted to know if I had anything else I was looking to sell. At first, I thought he meant furniture, so I told him no, that the couch was it. But then he got more specific, asking if I had any electronics or tools, or if I kept any valuables in the house. His tone was casual, but the questions themselves weren't. It felt like he was prying, testing me to see how much I'd reveal. I tried to keep calm and shrugged off his questions, telling him I wasn't selling anything else. That's when things started to feel more intense. His friend, who hadn't said a word, suddenly moved closer, standing right by the door, blocking the exit. My heart started racing, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I realized they weren't just here for the couch. They were trying to intimidate me, and maybe worse. I kept my cool as best I could, and casually mentioned that my roommate was on their way back, even though I lived alone. I said they'd be here any minute to help me move some things. Eric's expression changed slightly, and he gave his friend a quick glance. That was my opening. I told them they could take the couch, but if they weren't in a rush, they could wait outside for a few minutes until my roommate got here to help. For a second, I thought Eric was going to refuse, but then he smiled, this creepy, forced smile, and nodded. "Sure, we'll wait outside," he said, his voice too calm. They both left, but not before giving me one last look that made my skin crawl. The second they stepped out the door, I locked it behind them, my hands shaking. I watched through the window as they stood by their truck, talking quietly to each other. I didn't want to stick around to see what they'd do next, so I grabbed my phone and called a friend who lived nearby. I asked him to come over immediately and told him to make it look like he was coming home with me. My friend arrived about 15 minutes later, and as soon as Eric and his buddy saw another person, they got into their truck and drove off without taking the couch. The whole thing felt like it had been a setup from the start, like they were planning to rob me, or worse, once they were inside. The way they'd scoped out my place, the invasive questions, the way his friend blocked the door, it all made sense after the fact. After they left, I reported them on Facebook, but their profiles were gone. It was like they'd never existed. I called the police, but without a direct threat or crime, there wasn't much they could do. They advised me to be cautious with online sales and not let strangers into my home, which seemed like obvious advice in hindsight, but I'd let my guard down. I haven't sold anything online since. That experience stuck with me, and even though nothing physical happened, the fear of what could have happened is something I'll never forget. It was the middle of summer, and I was desperately searching for a new apartment. My lease was coming up fast, and I didn't want to renew it. I'd had enough of my old place, the noisy neighbours, the lack of space, and the sky-high rent. I was ready for something new, somewhere quieter, but I wasn't exactly rolling in money. So, like a lot of people, I turned to Facebook Marketplace, hoping to find a good deal. After scrolling through dozens of listings, I came across an ad that caught my eye immediately. It was for a 2-bedroom apartment in a really nice area, and the rent was way cheaper than anything else I'd seen. The pictures looked great. The place was fully furnished, had hardwood floors, and even came with a balcony. I couldn't believe my luck. I thought maybe the person just needed to rent it out quickly, which was why the price was so low. I messaged the owner right away. His name was Michael, and he responded within an hour. He explained that he was currently living out of state for work and was looking for someone to take over his lease for the next year. He seemed friendly and professional in his messages, even saying that he preferred a responsible tenant and was willing to offer a lower price in exchange for someone who would take good care of the place. It all sounded so reasonable. Too reasonable, now that I think about it. We exchanged a few more messages, and he sent me a virtual tour of the apartment. It looked exactly like the pictures. Clean, modern, perfect for what I needed. I asked if I could come by to see the place in person, but Michael said it wasn't possible since he was out of town. However, he assured me that everything was above board, and even offered to send me the lease agreement if I was serious about moving forward. I was skeptical, but honestly, I was running out of time. The idea of locking down a place without dealing with the hassle of open houses and applications sounded appealing. Michael's messages were polite, and he seemed trustworthy. Plus, the rent was unbeatable. That's where I made my first mistake. After a few more back and forths, he asked if I'd be willing to put down a security deposit to hold the place. He said he'd had several other inquiries, but wanted to give me the first option since I seemed like a serious tenant. It all felt a little rushed, but again, I was desperate. He sent me a lease to sign, and everything looked legit. The landlord's name, the address, the terms of the lease. It even had his signature at the bottom. So I went ahead and transferred the deposit. I didn't think twice about it. I mean, it was Facebook Marketplace, right? People used it all the time for stuff like this. After I sent the money, Michael thanked me and said he'd send over the keys via FedEx. He promised they'd arrive within 2 days, and I should plan to move in by the end of the week. I was ecstatic. I couldn't believe how easy it had been. But then the waiting began. A couple of days passed, and I didn't hear from him. I tried messaging him on Facebook to ask about the keys, but his responses became short, delayed. "Should be on the way," was all he said. I tried to stay patient, but something felt off. The excitement I'd felt when I first found the place was starting to turn into anxiety. By the 3rd day, I still hadn't received anything. That's when I decided to drive by the address he gave me, just to check things out and maybe get a feel for the neighborhood. I figured I'd at least be able to see the building and make sure everything looked okay. When I arrived, my stomach dropped. The building was real, but the apartment he claimed to be renting didn't exist. I stood there, staring at the door number he'd given me, but it didn't match any of the units in the building. Confused, I knocked on a few doors, hoping to get some answers. One of the neighbors came out, and I explained why I was there. She looked at me like she'd heard this story before. "You're not the first one to show up asking about that apartment," she said. "There's been a scam going around. People post fake listings, take your money and disappear. I'm sorry, but there's no apartment for rent here." My heart sank. I'd been scammed. I tried calling Michael, but the number he'd given me was disconnected. His Facebook profile had vanished and every trace of our conversation was gone. It was like he never existed. I felt sick to my stomach, not just because I'd lost a significant amount of money, but because I'd fallen for it so easily. I'd let my desperation cloud my judgment, and now I was out of $1,000 with no apartment to show for it. I went to the police, but there wasn't much they could do. They took a report, but they explained that these scammers use fake profiles and stolen identities, making them almost impossible to track. They advised me to be more cautious in the future, to never send money before meeting someone in person or seeing the property firsthand. It was cold comfort, knowing I'd been just another victim of a scam that probably played out countless times before. In the end, I found another apartment, this time through a proper rental agency, but the whole experience left me shaken. It's terrifying how easy it is to be taken advantage of when you're vulnerable, and how these scammers know exactly how to exploit that vulnerability. Even now, I'm wary of using Facebook Marketplace for anything.